Section 56 of All About Coffee. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. All About Coffee by William Ukers. History of Coffee and Literature, Part 5. Coffee Quips and Anecdotes. Coffee literature is full of quips and anecdotes. Probably the most famous coffee quip is that of Madame de Sévigné, who, as already told in Chapter 11, was wrongfully credited with saying, "Racine and coffee will pass." It was Voltaire in his preface to Irene who thus accused the amiable letter writer, and she, being dead, could not deny it. That Madame de Sévigné was at one time a coffee drinker is apparent from this quotation from one of her letters. The cavalier believes that coffee gives him warmth, and I, at the same time, foolish as you know me, do not take it any longer. La Roque called the beverage the king of perfumes, whose charm was enriched when vanilla was added. Émile Souvestre, 1806 1854, said, "Coffee keeps, so to say, the balance between bodily and spiritual nourishment." Isid Bourdon said, "The discovery of coffee has enlarged the realm of illusion, and given more promise to hope." An old Bourbon proverb says, "To an old man, a cup of coffee is like the doorpost of an old house. It sustains and strengthens him." Jardin says that in the Antilles, instead of orange blossoms, the brides carry a spray of coffee blossoms; and when a woman remains unmarried, they say she has lost her coffee branch. We say in France that she has coiffé Sainte Catherine. Fontenelle and Voltaire have both been quoted as authors of the famous reply to the remark that coffee was a slow poison. I think it must be, for I've been drinking it for 85 years and am not dead yet. In Medinger's German grammar, the slow poison bon mot is attributed to Fontenelle. It seems reasonable to give Fontenelle credit for this bon mot. Voltaire died at 84. Fontenelle lived to be nearly 100 years. Of his cheerfulness at an advanced age, an anecdote is related. In conversation one day, a lady a few years younger than Fontenelle playfully remarked, "Monsieur, you and I stay here so long, methinks death has forgotten us." "Hush! Speak in a whisper, madame," replied Fontenelle. "Tant mieux. So much the better. Don't remind him of us." Flaubert, Hugo, Baudelaire, Paul de Kock, Théophile Gautier, Alfred de Musset, Zola, Coppée, George Sand, Guy de Maupassant, and Sarah Bernhardt all have been credited with many clever or witty sallies about coffee. Prince Talleyrand, 1754 1839, the French diplomat and wit, has given us the cleverest summing up of the ideal cup of coffee. He said it should be noir comme le diable, chaud comme l'enfer, pur comme un ange, doux comme la mort, or in English, black as the devil, hot as hell, pure as an angel, sweet as love. This quip has been wrongfully attributed to Brillat-Savarin. Talleyrand said also, "A cup of coffee lightly tempered with good milk detracts nothing from your intellect. On the contrary, your stomach is freed by it, and no longer distresses your brain. It will not hamper your mind with troubles, but give freedom to its working. Suave molecules of mocha stir up your blood without causing excessive heat. The organ of thought receives from it a feeling of sympathy. Work becomes easier, and you will sit down without distress to your principal repast, which will restore your body and afford you a calm, delicious night." Among coffee drinkers, a high place must be given to Prince Bismarck, 1815 1898. He liked coffee unadulterated. While with the Prussian army in France, he one day entered a country inn and asked the host if he had any chicory in the house. He had. Bismarck said, "Well, bring it to me, all you have." The man obeyed, and handed Bismarck a canister full of chicory. "Are you sure this is all you have?" demanded the Chancellor. "Yes, my lord, every grain." "Then," said Bismarck, keeping the canister by him, "go now and make me a pot of coffee." This same story has been related of François Paul Jules Grévy, 1807 to 1891, President of France, 1879 to 1887. According to the French story, Grévy never took wine, even at dinner. He was, however, passionately fond of coffee. To be certain of having his favorite beverage of the best quality, he always, when he could, prepared it himself. Once he was invited, with a friend, Monsieur Bethman, to a hunting party by Monsieur Meunier, the celebrated manufacturer of chocolate at Noisiel. It happened that Monsieur Grévy and Monsieur Bethman lost themselves in the forest. Trying to find their way out, they stumbled upon a little wine house and stopped for a rest. They asked for something to drink. Monsieur Bethman found his wine excellent, but as usual Grévy would not drink. He wanted coffee, but he was afraid of the decoction which would be brought him. He got a good cup, however, and this is how he managed it. "Have you any chicory?" he said to the man. "Yes, sir." "Bring me some." Soon the proprietor returned with a small can of chicory. "Is that all you have?" asked Grévy. "We have a little more." "Bring me the rest." When he came again with another can of chicory, Grévy said, "You have no more?" "No, sir." "Very well. Now go and make me a cup of coffee." As already told, Louis XV had a great passion for coffee, which he made himself. Lenormand, the head gardener at Versailles, raised 6 pounds of coffee a year, which was for the exclusive use of the king. The king's fondness for coffee and for Madame du Barry gave rise to a celebrated anecdote of Louveciennes, which was accepted as true by many serious writers. It is told in this fashion by Mérobert in a pamphlet scandalizing Du Barry in 1776. His Majesty loves to make his own coffee and to forsake the cares of the government. One day the coffee pot was on the fire, and, His Majesty being occupied with something else, the coffee boiled over. "Oh, France, take care! Your coffee effed le camp!" cried the beautiful favorite. Charles Vatel has denied this story. It is related of Jean-Jacques Rousseau that once when he was walking in the Tuileries, he caught the aroma of roasting coffee. Turning to his companion, Bernardino de Saint Pierre, he said, "Ah, that is a perfume in which I delight. When they roast coffee near my house, I hasten to open the door to take in all the aroma." And such was the passion for coffee of this philosopher of Geneva that when he died, he just missed doing it with a cup of coffee in his hand. Barthez, confidential physician of Napoleon I, drank a great deal of it, freely, calling it the intellectual drink. Bonaparte himself said, "Strong coffee and plenty awakens me, it gives me a warmth, an unusual force, a pain that is not without pleasure. I would rather suffer than be senseless." Edward R. Emerson tells the following story of the Café Procope. One day while Monsieur Sainte-Foix was seated at his usual table in this café, an officer of the king's bodyguard entered, sat down, and ordered a cup of coffee with milk and a roll, adding, "It will serve me for a dinner." At this, Sainte-Foix remarked aloud that a cup of coffee with milk and a roll was a confoundedly poor dinner. The officer remonstrated. Sainte Foix reiterated his remark, adding that nothing he could say to the contrary would convince him that it was not a confoundedly poor dinner. Thereupon a challenge was given and accepted, and the whole company present adjourned as spectators to a duel, which ended by Sainte Foix receiving a wound in the arm. "That is all very well," said the wounded combatant, "but I call you to witness, gentlemen, that I am still profoundly convinced that a cup of coffee with milk and a roll is a confoundedly poor dinner." At this moment the principals were arrested and carried before the Duc de Noailles, in whose presence Sainte Foix, without waiting to be questioned, said: "Monseigneur, I had not the slightest intention of offending this gallant officer, who, I doubt not, is an honourable man. But your Excellency can never prevent my asserting that a cup of coffee with milk and a roll is a confoundedly poor dinner." "Why, so it is," said the Duke. "Then I am not in the wrong," persisted Sainte Foix, "and a cup of coffee—" At these words magistrates, delinquents, and auditory burst into a roar of laughter, and the antagonists forthwith became warm friends. Boswell, in his Life of Johnson, tells a story of an old chevalier de Motte, of ancienne noblesse, but in low circumstances, who was in a coffee house in Paris, where was also Julien, the great manufacturer at Gobelin, of fine tapestry, so much distinguished for the figures and the colours. The chevalier's carriage was very old. Says Julien with a plebeian insolence, "I think, sir, you had better have your carriage new painted." The chevalier looked at him with indignant contempt, and answered, "Well, sir, you may take it home and dye it." All the coffee house rejoiced at Julien's confusion. Sidney Smith, 1771 1845, the English clergyman and humorist, once said, "If you want to improve your understanding, drink coffee. It is the intellectual beverage." Our own William Dean Howells pays the beverage this tribute: "This coffee intoxicates without exciting, soothes you softly out of dull sobriety, makes you think and talk of all the pleasant things that ever happened to you." The wife of the President of the United States prefers coffee to tea. Afternoon guests at the White House may be refreshed, if they choose, by a sip of tea. But while tea is on tap for callers, Mrs. Harding always has coffee for those who, like herself, prefer it. Old London Coffee House Anecdotes. A good-sized volume might be compiled of the many anecdotes that have been written about habitués of the London coffee houses of the 17th and 18th centuries. Dr. Samuel Johnson, 1709 1784, the lexicographer, was one of the most constant frequenters of the coffee houses of his day. His big awkward figure was a familiar sight as he went about attended by his satellite, young James Boswell, who was to write about him for the delight of future generations in his marvellous Life of Johnson. The intellectual and moral peculiarities of the man found a natural expression in the coffee house. Johnson was 54 and Boswell only 23 when the two first met in Tom Davies' bookshop in Covent Garden. The story is told by Boswell with great particularity and characteristic naivete. Mr. Davies mentioned my name and respectfully introduced me to him. I was much agitated, and recollecting his prejudice against the Scotch, of which I had heard so much, I said to Davies, "Don't tell him where I come from." "From Scotland," cried Davies roguishly. "Mr. Johnson," said I do indeed come from Scotland, but I cannot help it." I am willing to flatter myself that I meant this as a light pleasantry to soothe and conciliate him, and not as a humiliating abasement at the expense of my country. But, however that might be, this speech was somewhat unlucky, for with that quickness of wit for which he was so remarkable, he seized the expression "come from Scotland," which I used, in the sense of being of that country; and if I had come away from it, or left it, he retorted, "That, sir, I find is what a great many of your countrymen cannot help." Nothing daunted, however, Boswell within a week called upon Johnson in his chambers. This time the doctor urged him to tarry. 3 weeks later he said to him, "Come to me as often as you can." Within a fortnight thereafter Boswell was giving the great man a sketch of his own life, and Johnson was exclaiming, "Give me your hand, I have taken a liking to you." When people began to ask, "Who is this Scotch cur at Johnson's heels?" Goldsmith replied, "He is not a cur, he is only a burr. Tom Davies flung him at Johnson in sport, and he has the faculty of sticking." Thus began one of the strangest friendships, out of which developed the most delightful biography in all literature. Boswell's taste for literary adventures and Johnson's literary vagrancy met in a companionship that found much satisfaction in the bohemianism of the inns and coffee houses of old London. Boswell thus describes the eccentric doctor's outlook on this mode of living: "We dined to-day at an excellent inn at Chapel House, where Mr. Johnson commented on English coffee houses and inns, remarking that the English triumphed over the French in one respect, in that the French had no perfection of tavern life. There is no private house," said he, "in which people can enjoy themselves so well as at a capital tavern. Let there be ever so great plenty of good things, ever so much grandeur, ever so much elegance, ever so much desire that everybody should be easy, in the nature of things it cannot be. There must always be some degree of care and anxiety. The master of the house is anxious to entertain his guests. The guests are anxious to be agreeable to him. And no man, but a very impudent dog indeed, can as freely command what is in another man's house as if it were his own. Whereas at a tavern there is a general freedom from anxiety. You are sure you are welcome, and the more noise you make, the more trouble you give, the more good things you call for, the welcomer you are. No servants will attend you with the alacrity which waiters do, who are incited by the prospect of an immediate reward, in proportion as they please. No, sir, there is nothing which has yet been contrived by man, by which so much happiness is produced as by a good tavern or inn." He then repeated with great emotion Shenstone's lines: "Whoe'er has travelled life's dull round, where'er his stages may have been, may sigh to think he still has found his warmest welcome at an inn." Patient delving into Johnsoniana is rewarded with many anecdotes about the mad doctor-philosopher and his faithful reporter, who delighted in translating his genius to the world. Boswell was a wine-bibber, but Johnson confessed to being a hardened and shameless tea drinker. When Boswell twigged him for abstaining from the stronger drink, the doctor replied, "Sir, I have no objection to a man's drinking wine, if he can do it in moderation. I find myself apt to go to excess in it, and therefore, after having been for some time without it on account of illness, I thought it better not to return to it." Another time he said of tea, "What a delightful beverage must that be that pleases all palates at a time when they can take nothing else at breakfast." In his early days Johnson had David Garrick as an unwilling pupil. After the actor had become famous and his prosperity had turned his head, he was wont to put the table in a roar by mimicking the doctor's grimaces. There is a story that on the occasion of a certain dinner party where both were guests, Garrick indulged in a coarse jest on the great man's table manners. After the merriment had subsided, Dr. Johnson arose solemnly and said, "Gentlemen, you must doubtless suppose from the extreme familiarity with which Mr. Garrick has thought fit to treat me, that I am an acquaintance of his. But I can assure you that until I met him here, I never saw him but once before, and then I paid 5 shillings for the sight." A certain sycophant, thinking to curry favor with Johnson, took to laughing loud and long at everything he said. Johnson's patience at last became exhausted, and after a particularly objectionable outburst, he turned upon the boor with, "Pray, sir, what is the matter? I hope I have not said anything which you can comprehend." Because of his physical and mental disabilities, Dr. Johnson was not a good social animal. Nevertheless, when it pleased his humor, he could be the cavalier, for his mind overcame every impediment. It is related of him that once, when a lady who was showing him around her garden expressed her regret at being unable to bring a particular flower to perfection, he arose gallantly to the occasion by taking her hand and remarking, "Then, madam, permit me to bring perfection to the flower." Again, when Mrs. Siddons, the great English tragedienne, called upon him in his chambers, and the servant did not promptly bring her a chair, his quick wit made capital of the incident by the remark, "You see, madam, wherever you go, there are no seats to be had." John Thomas Smith, in his Antiquarian Rambles in the Streets of London, 1846, tells an amusing incident in the life of Sir George Etheredge, the playwright, who having run up a bill at Locket's Ordinary, a coffee house much frequented by dramatists of the period, and finding himself unable to pay, began to absent himself from the place. Mrs. Locket thereupon sent a man to Dun, and to threaten him with prosecution if he did not pay. Sir George sent back word that if she stirred a step in the matter, he would kiss her. On receiving this answer, the good lady, much exasperated, called for her hood and scarf, and told her husband, who interposed, that she would see if there was any fellow alive who would have the impudence. "Prithee, my dear, don't be so rash," said her husband. "There is no telling what a man may do in his passion." Richard Savage, the English poet and friend of Johnson, who included him in his famous Lives of the Poets, was arrested for the murder of James Sinclair, after a drunken brawl in Robinson's Coffee House in 1727. He was found guilty, but narrowly escaped the death penalty by the intercession of the Countess of Hertford. A feature of his trial was the extraordinary charge to the jury of Judge Page, who, for his hard words and his love of hanging, is damned to everlasting fame in the verse of Pope. The charge was, "Gentlemen of the jury, you are to consider that Mr. Savage is a very great man, a much greater man than you or I, gentlemen of the jury; that he wears very fine clothes, much finer than you or I, gentlemen of the jury; that he has an abundance of money in his pocket, much more money than you or I, gentlemen of the jury. But, gentlemen of the jury, is it not a very hard case, gentlemen of the jury, that Mr. Savage should therefore kill you or me, gentlemen of the jury?" Albert V. Lally has made a collection of old coffee-house anecdotes. Among them are the following. The story is told of how Sir Richard Steele, in Button's Coffee House, was once made the umpire in an amusing difference between two unnamed disputants. These two were arguing about religion, when one of them said, "I wonder, sir, you should talk of religion, when I'll hold you 5 guineas you can't say the Lord's Prayer." "Done," said the other, "and Sir Richard Steele shall hold the stakes." The money being deposited, the gentleman began with, "I believe in God," and so went right through the creed. "Well," said the other when he had finished, "I didn't think he could have done it." There is another story of a famous judge, Sir Nicholas Bacon, who was importuned by a criminal to spare his life on account of kinship. "How so?" demanded the judge. "Because my name is Hogg and yours is Bacon, and Hogg and Bacon are so near akin that they cannot be separated." "Ay," responded the judge dryly, "but you and I cannot yet be kindred, for Hogg is not Bacon until it is well hanged." On another occasion, a nervous barrister pleading before this same judge began with repeated references to his unfortunate client. "Go on, sir," said the judge. "So far the court is with you." Of Jonathan Swift it is related that a gentleman who had sought to persuade him to accept an invitation to dinner said, in way of special inducement, "I'll send you my bill of fare." "Send me rather your bill of company," retorted Swift, showing his appreciation of the truth that not that which is eaten, but those who eat, form the more important part of a good dinner. On the occasion when the dreadful Judge Jeffreys was trying Compton, Bishop of London, before the Court of High Commission, that prelate, as Campbell relates in his Lives of the Lord Chancellors, complained of having no copy of the indictment. Jeffreys replied to this excuse that all the coffee houses had it for a penny. The case being resumed after the lapse of a week, the bishop again protested that he was unprepared, owing to his continued difficulty in obtaining a copy of the necessary document. Jeffreys was obliged once more to adjourn the case, and in so doing offered this bantering apology. "My lord," said he, "in telling you our commission was to be seen in every coffee house, I did not speak with any design to reflect on your lordship as if you were a haunter of coffee houses. I abhor the thoughts of it." As the judge had once been distinctly opposed to the party and principles which he went to such a length in supporting, so had he formerly owed something to the very institution against which his last blow was directed. Roger North relates, and Campbell repeats the story, that, after he was called to the bar, he used to sit in coffee houses and order his man to come and tell him that company attended him at his chamber, at which he would huff and say, "Let them stay a little, I will come presently," and thus made a show of business. John Timms, in his Clubs and Club Life in London, has a host of anecdotes and stories of the old London coffee houses, among them the following. Garraway's noted coffee house, situated in Change Alley, Cornhill, had a threefold celebrity. Tea was first sold in England here. It was a place of great resort in the time of the South Sea bubble, and was later a place of great mercantile transactions. The original proprietor was Thomas Garraway, tobacconist and coffeeman, the first who retailed tea, recommending it as a cure of all disorders. Ogleby, the compiler of the Britannia, had his standing lottery of books at Mr. Garraway's coffee house from April 7, 1673, till wholly drawn off, and in the Journey through England, 1722, Garraway's, Robins, and Joe's are described as the three celebrated coffee houses. In the first, the people of quality, who have business in the city, and the most considerable and wealthy citizens frequent. In the second, the foreign banquiers, and often even foreign ministers. And in the third, the buyers and sellers of stock. Wines were sold at Garraway's in 1673 by the candle, that is, by auction, while an inch of candle burns. In the Tatler, No. 147, we read, "Upon my coming home last night, I found a very handsome present of French wine left for me as a taste of 216 hogshead, which are to be put on sale at £20 a hogshead at Garraway's Coffee House in Exchange Alley, etc. The sale by candle is not, however, by candle light, but during the day. At the commencement of the sale, when the auctioneer has read a description of the property, and the conditions on which it is to be disposed of, a piece of candle, usually an inch long, is lighted, and he who is the last bidder at the time the light goes out is declared the purchaser." Swift, in his Ballad on the South Sea Scheme, 1721, did not forget Garraway's "There is a gulf where thousands fell, Here all the bold adventurers came. A narrow sound, though deep as hell, Change Alley is the dreadful name. Subscribers here by thousands float, And jostle one another down, Each paddling in his leaky boat, And here they fish for gold and drown. Now buried in the depths below, Now mounted up to heaven again, They reel and stagger to and fro, At their wits' end like drunken men. Meantime, secure on Garway cliffs, A savage race, by shipwrecks fed, Lie waiting for the foundered skiffs, And strip the bodies of the dead. Dr. Jano Radcliffe, who was a rash speculator in the South Sea Scheme, was usually planted at a table at Garraway's about exchange time, to watch the turn of the market, and here he was seated when the footman of his powerful rival, Dr. Edward Hans, came into Garraway's and inquired, by way of a puff, if Dr. H. was there. Dr. Radcliffe, who was surrounded with several apothecaries and chirurgeons that flocked about him, cried out, "Dr. Hans is not here," and desired to know who wants him. The fellow's reply was, "Such a lord and such a lord." But he was taken up with the dry rebuke, "No, no, friend, you are mistaken. The doctor wants those lords." One of Radcliffe's ventures was 5,000 guineas upon one South Sea project. When he was told at Garraway's that "'twas all lost," "Why," said he, "'tis but going up 5,000 pair of stairs more." This answer, says Tom Brown, deserved a statue. Jonathan's Coffee House was another Change Alley coffee house, which is described in the Tatler, No. 38, as the general mart of stock jobbers, and the Spectator No. 1 tells us that he sometimes passes for a Jew in the assembly of stock jobbers at Jonathan's. This was their rendezvous, where gambling of all sorts was carried on, notwithstanding a former prohibition against the assemblage of the jobbers, issued by the city of London, which prohibition continued unrepealed until 1825. The Spectator No. 16 notices some gay frequenters of the Rainbow Coffee House in Fleet Street. I have received a letter desiring me to be very satirical upon the little muff that is now in fashion. Another informs me of a pair of silver garters, buckled below the knee, that have been lately seen at the Rainbow Coffee House in Fleet Street. Mr. Moncrieff, the dramatist, used to tell that about 1780 this house was kept by his grandfather, Alexander Moncrieff, when it retained its original title of the Rainbow Coffee House. Nando's Coffee House, at the east corner of Inner Temple Lane, No. 17, Fleet Street, by some confused with Groom's House, No. 16, was the favorite haunt of Lord Thurlow before he dashed into law practice. At this coffee house a large attendance of professional loungers was attracted by the fame of the punch and the charms of the landlady, which, with the small wits, were duly admired by and at the bar. One evening the famous cause of Douglas versus the Duke of Hamilton was the topic of discussion, when Thurlow being present, it was suggested, half in earnest, to appoint him junior counsel, which was done. This employment brought him acquaintance with the Duchess of Queensberry, who saw at once the value of a man like Thurlow, and recommended Lord Bute to secure him by a silk gown. Dick's Coffee House at No. 8 Fleet Street, South Side, near Temple Bar, was originally Richard's, named from Richard Torner or Turner, to whom the house was let in 1680. Richard's was frequented by Cowper when he lived in the Temple. In his own account of his insanity, Cowper tells us, "At breakfast I read the newspaper, and in it a letter, which, the further I perused it, the more closely engaged my attention. I cannot now recollect the purport of it, but before I had finished it, it appeared demonstratively true to me that it was a libel or satire upon me. The author appeared to be acquainted with my purpose of self-destruction, and to have written that letter on purpose to secure and hasten the execution of it. My mind probably at this time began to be disordered. However it was, I was certainly given to a strong delusion. I said within myself, 'Your cruelty shall be gratified, you shall have your revenge,' and flinging down the paper in a fit of strong passion, I rushed hastily out of the room, directing my way towards the fields, where I intended to find some house to die in, or, if not, determined to poison myself in a ditch where I could meet with one sufficiently retired. Lloyd's Coffee House was one of the earliest establishments of its kind. It is referred to in a poem printed in the year 1700, called The Wealthy Shopkeeper, or Charitable Christian. Now to Lloyd's Coffee House he never fails, to read the letters and attend the sales. In 1710, Steele, Tatler No. 246, dates from Lloyd's his petition on coffee house orators and news vendors, and Addison, in Spectator, April 23, 1711, relates this droll incident: "About a week since there happened to me a very odd accident. By reason of one of these, my papers of minutes which I had accidentally dropped at Lloyd's Coffee House, where the auctions are usually kept. Before I missed it, there were a cluster of people who had found it, and were diverting themselves with it at one end of the coffee house. It had raised so much laughter among them before I observed what they were about, that I had not the courage to own it. The boy of the coffee house, when they had done with it, carried it about in his hand, asking everybody if they had dropped a written paper, but nobody challenging it, he was ordered by those merry gentlemen, who had before perused it, to get up into the auction pulpit and read it to the whole room, that if anybody would own it they might. The boy accordingly mounted the pulpit, and with a very audible voice read what proved to be minutes, which made the whole coffee house very merry. Some of them concluded it was written by a madman, and others by somebody that had been taking notes out of the Spectator. After it was read, and the boy was coming out of the pulpit, the Spectator reached his arm out, and desired the boy to give it him, which was done according. This drew the whole eyes of the company upon the Spectator, but after casting a cursory glance over it, he shook his head twice or thrice at the reading of it, twisted it into a kind of match, and lighted his pipe with it. My profound silence, says the Spectator, together with the steadiness of my countenance, and the gravity of my behavior during the whole transaction raised a very loud laugh on all sides of me. But as I had escaped all suspicion of being the author, I was very well satisfied, and applying myself to my pipe and the postman, took no further notice of anything that passed about me. The Smyrna Coffee House in Pall Mall was, in the reign of Queen Anne, famous for that cluster of wise heads, found sitting every evening from the left side of the fire to the door. The following announcement in the Tatler, No. 78, is amusing. This is to give notice to all ingenious gentlemen in and about the cities of London and Westminster, who have a mind to be instructed in the noble sciences of music, poetry, and politics, that they repair to the Smyrna Coffee House in Pall Mall betwixt the hours of 8 and 10 at night, where they may be instructed gratis, with elaborate essays, by word of mouth, on all or any of the above-mentioned arts. St. James's Coffee House was the famous Whig coffee house from the time of Queen Anne till late in the reign of George III. It was the last house but one on the southwest corner of St. James Street, and is thus mentioned in No. 1 of the Tatler. Foreign and domestic news you will have from St. James Coffee House. It occurs also in the passage quoted previously from the Spectator. The St. James's was much frequented by Swift. Letters for him were left here. In his journal to Stella he says, "I met Mr. Harley, and he asked me how long I had learnt the trick of writing to myself. He had seen your letter through the glass case at the coffee house, and would swear it was my hand." Eliot, who kept the coffee house, was on occasions placed on a friendly footing with his guests. Swift, in his journal to Stella, November 19, 1710, records an odd instance of this familiarity. "This evening I christened our coffee man Eliot's child, when the rogue had a most noble supper, and Steele and I sat amongst some scurvy company over a bowl of punch." In the first advertisement of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu's Town Eclogues, they are stated to have been read over at the St. James's Coffee House, when they were considered by the general voice to be productions of a lady of quality. From the proximity of the house to St. James's Palace, it was much frequented by the guards, and we read of its being no uncommon circumstance to see Dr. Joseph Wharton at breakfast in the St. James Coffee House, surrounded by officers of the guards, who listened with the utmost attention and pleasure to his remarks. To show the order and regularity observed at the St. James, we may quote the following advertisement, appended to the Tatler, No. 25. "To prevent all mistakes that may happen among gentlemen of the other end of the town, who come but once a week to St. James Coffee House, either by miscalling the servants, or requiring such things from them as are not properly within their respective provinces, this is to give notice that Kidney, keeper of the book debts of the outlying customers, and observer of those who go off without paying, having resigned that employment, is succeeded by John Soton, to whose place of enterer of messages and first coffee grinder William Bird is promoted, and Samuel Burdock comes as shoe cleaner in the room of the said Bird." But the St. James is more memorable as the house where originated Goldsmith's celebrated poem, Retaliation. The poet belonged to a temporary association of men of talent, some of them members of the club, who dined together occasionally here. At these dinners he was generally the last to arrive. On one occasion, when he was later than usual, a whim seized the company to write epitaphs on him as the late Dr. Goldsmith, and several were thrown off in a playful vein. The only one extant was written by Garrick, and has been preserved, very probably, by its pungency. Here lies poet Goldsmith, for shortness called Noll. He wrote like an angel, but talked like poor Poll. Goldsmith did not relish the sarcasm, especially coming from such a quarter, and by way of retaliation he produced the famous poem, of which Cumberland has left a very interesting account, but which Mr. Forster, in his Life of Goldsmith, states to be pure romance. The poem itself, however, with what was prefixed to it when published, sufficiently explains its own origin. What had formerly been abrupt and strange in Goldsmith's manners had now so visibly increased as to become matter of increased sport to such as were ignorant of its cause; and a proposition made at one of the dinners, when he was absent, to write a series of epitaphs upon him, his country dialect, and his awkward person, was agreed to, and put in practice by several of the guests. The active aggressors appear to have been Garrick, Dr. Bernard, Richard Burke, and Caleb Whiteford. Cumberland says he, too, wrote an epitaph, but it was complimentary and grave, and hence the grateful return he received. Mr. Forster considers Garrick's epitaph to indicate the tone of all. This, with the rest, was read to Goldsmith when he next appeared at the St. James's Coffee House, where Cumberland, however, says he never again met his friends. But the doctor was called on for retaliation, says the friend who published the poem with that name, and at their next meeting produced the following, which I think adds one leaf to his immortal wreath. Retaliation, says Sir Walter Scott, had the effect of placing the author on a more equal footing with his society than he had ever before assumed. Cumberland's account differs from the version formerly received, which intimates that the epitaphs were written before Goldsmith arrived, whereas the pun, the late Dr. Goldsmith, appears to have suggested the writing of the epitaphs. In the Retaliation, Goldsmith has not spared the characters and failings of his associates, but has drawn them with satire, at once pungent and good-humored. Garrick is smartly chastised. Burke, the dinner belle of the House of Commons, is not let off. And of all the more distinguished names of the club, Thomson, Cumberland, and Reynolds alone escape the lash of the satirist. The former is not mentioned, and the two latter are even dismissed with unqualified and affectionate applause. Still, we quote Cumberland's account of the Retaliation, which is very amusing from the closely circumstantial manner in which the incidents are narrated, although they have so little relationship to truth. It was upon a proposal started by Edmund Burke that a party of friends who had dined together at Sir Joshua Reynolds' and my house should meet at the St. James's Coffee House, which accordingly took place, and was repeated occasionally with much festivity and good fellowship. Dr. Bernard, Dean of Derry, a very amiable and old friend of mine, Dr. Douglas, since Bishop of Salisbury, Johnson, David Garrick, Sir Joshua Reynolds, Oliver Goldsmith, Edmund and Richard Burke, Hickey, with 2 or 3 others, constituted our party. At one of these meetings an idea was suggested of extemporary epitaphs upon the parties present. Pen and ink were called for, and Garrick, off-hand, wrote an epitaph with a good deal of humour upon poor Goldsmith, who was the first in jest, as he proved to be in reality, that we committed to the grave. The Dean also gave him an epitaph, and Sir Joshua illuminated the Dean's verses with a sketch of his bust, in pen and ink, inimitably caricatured. Neither Johnson nor Burke wrote anything, and when I perceived that Oliver was rather sore, and seemed to watch me with that kind of attention which indicated his expectation of something in the same kind of burlesque with theirs, I thought it time to press the joke no further, and wrote a few couplets at a side table, which, when I had finished, and was called upon by the company to exhibit, Goldsmith with much agitation besought me to spare him, and I was about to tear them, when Johnson wrested them out of my hand, and in a loud voice read them at the table. I have now lost recollection of them, and, in fact, they were little worth remembering; but as they were serious and complimentary, the effect upon Goldsmith was the more pleasing for being so entirely unexpected. The concluding line, which was the only one I can call to mind, was, "All mourn the poet, I lament the man." This I recollect, because he repeated it several times, and seemed much gratified by it. At our next meeting he produced his epitaphs, and this was the last time he ever enjoyed the company of his friends. Section 57